For decades, Louisiana State Penitentiary, better known as Angola Prison, has carried a reputation unlike any other prison in the United States. Built on former plantation land and surrounded by miles of farmland, Angola is already symbolic of America's harshest realities about incarceration. But within this prison exists something that feels almost impossible to believe: a public rodeo held inside the walls of a maximum security prison where inmates perform dangerous events for cheering crowds. The Angola Prison Rodeo is often described as a tradition, a fundraiser, and even a form of rehabilitation. Supporters call it a rare opportunity for inmates to earn money, express skill, and experience something resembling normal life. Critics call it something else entirely: a spectacle built on risk, pain, and exploitation, staged for entertainment. To understand why this rodeo exists, and why it remains so controversial, it is necessary to understand Angola itself. Angola Prison is the largest maximum security prison in the United States by land area. It sits on more than 18,000 acres of land in rural Louisiana, bordered on three sides by the Mississippi River. Isolation has always been part of its function. Once inside, escape is nearly impossible. Most of the men incarcerated here are serving life sentences. For many, Angola is not a phase of life. It is the end of it. For much of its history, Angola was known as one of the most violent prisons in America. Before major reforms in the 1990s, inmate-on-inmate murders were common. Guards were understaffed. Gangs controlled sections of the prison. Violence was normalized. In that environment, survival often depended on strength, alliances, or invisibility. It was during this era, long before Angola's modern image of reform and order, that the prison rodeo became embedded into the institution. The Angola Prison Rodeo began in the 1960s. At the time, the prison was struggling financially and socially. Public perception of Angola was overwhelmingly negative. Violence inside the prison was widely known. Administrators searched for ways to fund programs, improve morale, and present a more controlled image of the institution to the outside world. The rodeo emerged as a solution. At first, it was small. Inmate cowboys competed in traditional rodeo events, riding bulls and broncos borrowed from local ranchers. The events were dangerous, but the risk was part of the appeal. The prison opened its gates to the public, allowing civilians to enter the grounds and watch incarcerated men perform feats normally reserved for professional rodeos. Over time, the event grew. By the 1990s and early 2000s, the Angola Prison Rodeo had become one of the most unusual spectacles in American corrections. Thousands of spectators would attend on weekends, buying tickets, food, and souvenirs. The prison sold crafts made by inmates. Families arrived with children. Music played. Announcements echoed across the arena. Inside the ring, inmates prepared to face animals that outweighed them by hundreds of pounds. The most infamous event, known as convict poker, involved inmates sitting at a table placed in the center of the arena while a bull was released. The last man remaining seated won a prize. The crowd cheered as bodies were thrown into the dirt. Another event, Guts and Glory, required inmates to retrieve a poker chip tied to the horns of a charging bull. Success was rare. Injuries were common. These were not trained professional athletes. These were incarcerated men, many with little rodeo experience, taking enormous risks for a chance at prize money that often amounted to a few $100s. Supporters of the rodeo argue that participation is voluntary. Inmates sign waivers. They understand the danger. They train. They choose to compete. The money earned can be sent to families, saved for commissary, or used after release, if release is even possible. But critics argue that voluntariness inside a prison is complicated. Most Angola inmates are serving life sentences. Many have limited opportunities to earn money. Prison wages are extremely low. The rodeo offers one of the few chances to earn significant funds in a single day. For men with nothing but time, the risk can feel worth it. This is where the ethical questions begin. Is it truly a choice when the alternative is poverty, monotony, and decades of confinement? Is entertainment still ethical when the performers are incarcerated and the danger is real? Angola officials often describe the rodeo as a form of rehabilitation. They point to discipline, teamwork, and responsibility. They emphasize that proceeds from the event fund inmate programs, education, and recreation. They argue that the rodeo provides purpose in an environment where purpose is rare. There is truth in parts of that argument. Some inmates have spoken positively about the rodeo. They describe it as something to look forward to. a break from routine, a moment when the outside world feels close. They speak about pride in their skills and the dignity of being seen as something other than a prisoner. Others tell a different story. Former participants have described severe injuries, broken bones, concussions, and long-term pain. Medical care exists, but recovery happens inside prison walls. There is no professional insurance, no career after injury, no future competition. Once hurt, an inmate returns to his cell to heal alone. The crowd goes home. The Angola Prison Rodeo occupies a strange place in American culture. It is both celebrated and criticized. It appears in documentaries, news segments, and viral videos. Some viewers see it as a fascinating tradition. Others see it as a reminder of how incarceration strips people of bargaining power. What makes the rodeo especially controversial is its public nature. This is not an internal prison program. It is entertainment sold to paying spectators. The line between rehabilitation and spectacle becomes blurred. In many ways, the rodeo reflects Angola itself, a prison shaped by history, labor, and punishment. The land Angola sits on was once a plantation worked by enslaved people. After the Civil War, the state leased prisoners to private interests. Forced labor replaced slavery in all but name. The prison rodeo exists on that same land, echoing uncomfortable historical parallels that critics argue cannot be ignored. Supporters reject those comparisons. They argue that modern Angola is not its past. They point to reduced violence, educational programs, and religious initiatives. They say the rodeo should be viewed in context, as an option, not an obligation. Yet the question remains unresolved. When inmates risk their lives for entertainment, who benefits most? The prisoners? The prison system? Or the audience? The Angola Prison Rodeo continues to draw crowds year after year. Tickets sell out. Media coverage resurfaces. And each time, the same debate returns. Is this an opportunity or exploitation? And more importantly, why does a maximum security prison need a rodeo at all? This question does not have an easy answer. And the deeper the story goes, the more complicated it becomes. Because to understand the rodeo fully, it is necessary to look not just at the arena, but at the system that made it possible, the incentives that sustain it, and the people who live with the consequences long after the dust settles. And that story is only beginning. As the Angola Prison Rodeo grew in popularity, it became more than a local event. What began as a small fundraising activity slowly turned into a national spectacle. Visitors traveled from across Louisiana, then from other states, drawn by the idea of witnessing something that felt forbidden. Incarcerated men performing dangerous physical feats inside one of America's most notorious prisons. By the 1960s and 1970s, the rodeo had become deeply embedded in Angola's identity. It was promoted as a family-friendly event, a rare opportunity for the public to enter the prison grounds. Vendors sold food. Children laughed. Music played. Outside the arena, it looked like a county fair. Inside, it was something very different. Inmates were the performers. They were not professional rodeo athletes. Most had no prior experience with rodeo events before entering prison. Yet they were asked to ride bulls, wrestle livestock, and participate in high-risk competitions where injury was not a possibility. It was an expectation. Participation was officially voluntary. Inmates were not forced to compete. But the reality inside Angola complicated the idea of choice. Prison wages were extremely low, often measured in cents per hour. The rodeo offered prize money far beyond what inmates could earn through regular prison labor. For men serving long or life sentences, the opportunity to earn money, to support families, pay legal fees, or save for commissary, carried enormous weight. The financial incentive changed the calculation. Refusing to participate meant staying poor inside a system where money controlled access to basic comforts. Accepting meant risking broken bones, concussions, or worse. For some inmates, the danger felt worth it. For others, it felt like the only option available. The most infamous event in the rodeo became known as convict poker. In this event, several inmates sat around a table placed inside the arena while a bull was released. The last man remaining seated won the prize. The crowd laughed as the bull charged, flipping tables and throwing bodies through the air. From the stands, it was entertainment. On the ground, it was chaos. Another event, Guts and Glory, required inmates to retrieve a poker chip tied to a bull's horn. The objective was simple. The risk was obvious. Injuries were frequent. Broken ribs, crushed limbs, and head trauma were common outcomes. Medical staff stood by, not as a precaution, but as a necessity. To supporters of the rodeo, these risks were justified. Prison officials argued that the event gave inmates a sense of purpose. It allowed them to develop discipline, teamwork, and confidence. They pointed to inmates who trained for months, took pride in their performance, and viewed the rodeo as a rare chance to feel human again inside an institution designed to strip individuality away. Some inmates echoed this view. Interviews with former participants revealed conflicting emotions. Many spoke about the rodeo as a highlight of their year, a moment when they were seen not as inmates, but as competitors. 4 men locked behind bars, being cheered by thousands of people felt intoxicating. But those cheers came at a cost. Critics argued that the rodeo blurred a dangerous line between rehabilitation and exploitation. The audience was not watching professional athletes who could walk away after the event. They were watching incarcerated men whose lives were already controlled by the state, taking extreme risks for public amusement. The question became unavoidable. Could consent truly exist in a prison environment? Angola's history made that question even more uncomfortable. For decades, the prison had operated under brutal conditions. In the mid-20th century, Angola was infamous for violence, forced labor, and racial segregation. Inmates worked long hours in the fields under armed supervision. Many were serving life sentences with no hope of release. Against that backdrop, the rodeo took on a different meaning. To critics, it looked less like entertainment and more like a modern extension of exploitation. Incarcerated bodies used to generate profit and spectacle for the outside world. Human rights organizations began to raise concerns. They questioned whether inmates were adequately protected, whether medical care was sufficient, and whether the financial benefits truly reached the men risking their lives. While the prison claimed that proceeds supported inmate programs, transparency was limited. The public saw the show, not the aftermath. Injuries rarely made headlines. Broken bones were treated quietly. Concussions were downplayed. Long-term damage went undocumented. For inmates serving life sentences, chronic pain became part of their reality long after the crowds went home. Yet despite criticism, the rodeo continued. For Louisiana officials, the event served multiple purposes. It generated revenue. It softened the prison's public image. It created a narrative of opportunity and reform that contrasted sharply with Angola's violent past. The rodeo became a symbol, not of punishment, but of redemption. That symbolism was powerful, but also misleading. The reality inside Angola did not change simply because the public was allowed inside once a year. Overcrowding persisted. Harsh sentences remained. Violence, though reduced, did not disappear. The rodeo offered a brief window into the prison, but it did not reveal the full picture. As decades passed, Angola evolved. Legal reforms, court rulings, and leadership changes transformed the prison's daily operations. Violence declined. Education programs expanded. Angola was no longer the bloodiest prison in America, but the rodeo remained. It adapted to the new era, rebranding itself as a tradition, a cultural event, and a source of pride. Supporters framed it as a voluntary activity that gave inmates dignity and agency. Critics continued to see something darker, a spectacle rooted in power imbalance and public fascination with danger. The inmates, once again, were caught in the middle. Some prepared all year for the rodeo, training their bodies, studying livestock behavior, and imagining victory. Others avoided it entirely, unwilling to risk injury for money or applause. The prison allowed both choices, but the environment ensured that neither was free from pressure. As attendance grew, so did the scrutiny. Journalists began asking harder questions. Scholars examined the ethics of prison entertainment. The rodeo became a case study in how punishment, profit, and public curiosity intersect behind prison walls. What exactly were audiences paying to see? Was it courage, desperation, or a performance shaped by a system that left inmates with few alternatives? Those questions followed the Angola Prison Rodeo into the modern era, where it continues to exist, celebrated by some, condemned by others, and defended by the institution that profits from it. And as the crowds gather each year, the central dilemma remains unresolved. Is the rodeo a rare moment of empowerment inside a place built on control? Or is it a reminder that even in reform, prisons can still turn punishment into spectacle? The answer depends on where you stand, in the arena or behind the bars. As the Angola Prison Rodeo grew in popularity, its structure became more formalized, but the underlying tension never disappeared. What the public saw on Rodeo Day was a carefully staged event, controlled, scheduled, and marketed, but beneath that surface remained the reality of where it took place. This was still a maximum security prison. Most of the men participating were serving life sentences. Many would never leave Angola alive. For the inmates, the rodeo represented a rare disruption to the monotony of prison life. Angola is isolated geographically and socially. Days are rigid, repetitive, and heavily controlled. The rodeo introduced something unfamiliar: anticipation. Weeks before the event, inmates trained in makeshift conditions, practicing with borrowed equipment, visualizing events they had little professional preparation for. Injuries were expected. Pain was accepted as part of the cost. Participation was technically voluntary, but the definition of choice inside a prison is complicated. In a place where options are limited, even dangerous opportunities can feel like freedom. Inmates who joined the rodeo spoke about the chance to feel adrenaline again, to be seen as something other than a prisoner, even if only for a few seconds in front of a cheering crowd. The most infamous event, convict poker, became the clearest symbol of the controversy surrounding the rodeo. In this event, several inmates sat at a poker table placed inside the arena while a bull was released. The last man to remain seated won prize money. The rules were simple. The danger was obvious. Injuries were common. From the outside, the spectacle was shocking. Critics argued that the event reduced inmates to entertainment, turning violence into a commodity for public consumption. Supporters countered that participation was optional and that inmates understood the risks. But the question remained unresolved. Could true consent exist in a place built on coercion? Financial incentives added another layer of complexity. Inmates were paid modestly for participation, and prize money could reach amounts that were significant inside prison but minimal by outside standards. Meanwhile, the rodeo generated millions of dollars over the years. That money funded inmate programs, education, and recreational activities that otherwise might not exist. Supporters pointed to this as evidence of benefit. Without the rodeo, many programs would lose funding. Critics responded that this created a moral dilemma. Essential services were being funded through dangerous entertainment involving incarcerated men. The system depended on spectacle to function. Medical staff were present during events, but injuries were frequent. Broken bones, concussions, internal injuries, and long-term damage were accepted risks. Some inmates returned to cells with injuries that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Recovery happened inside prison, with limited rehabilitation and ongoing physical labor demands. As the rodeo gained national attention, it became a symbol of Angola itself. Media coverage often portrayed it as a uniquely southern phenomenon, blending punishment, tradition, and spectacle. Some stories focused on the festive atmosphere, the families in the stands, the food vendors, and the music. Others focused on the men in the arena, facing animals that outweighed them by hundreds of pounds. The contrast was uncomfortable. Children watched men get thrown, trampled, and injured. Applause followed moments of real pain. The line between sport and suffering blurred. Inside the prison, opinions among inmates were divided. Some defended the rodeo fiercely, arguing that it gave them something to look forward to, a sense of purpose, and a chance to earn money for themselves or their families. Others refused to participate, seeing it as a form of exploitation that benefited the institution more than the men risking their bodies. Former participants spoke about the psychological impact as much as the physical. For a brief moment, they were not just inmates. They were competitors. Then the gates closed again, and they returned to their cells, often injured, always confined. Administrators emphasized safety improvements over time. Equipment was upgraded. Rules were adjusted. Certain events were modified or removed after public criticism. But the core concept remained unchanged. Inmates would perform dangerous acts in front of paying spectators. Human rights organizations continued to raise concerns. They argued that the rodeo normalized violence against incarcerated people and framed suffering as entertainment. The comparison to historical spectacles was unavoidable. Critics pointed to a long history of prisons using inmate labor and risk for institutional benefit, often justified as voluntary or rehabilitative. Defenders of the rodeo rejected those comparisons. They highlighted inmate testimonies supporting the event. They emphasized the tangible benefits funded by rodeo revenue. They argued that removing the rodeo would not improve prison conditions. It would simply remove one of the few positive outlets available to inmates. The debate grew more complex as Angola itself changed. Under new leadership in the 1990s, the The prison reduced violence, expanded education programs, and improved living conditions relative to its past. The rodeo became part of a broader narrative of reform. Yet its existence remained controversial precisely because it thrived alongside those reforms. As years passed, participation declined slightly as older inmates aged out of eligibility and younger inmates weighed the risks more carefully. Still, the event continued, drawing crowds and revenue. For the public, it became tradition. For the prison, it became infrastructure. The rodeo also served as a rare point of contact between inmates and the outside world. Families could attend. Letters referenced the event. News coverage reminded the public that Angola existed at all. In a system where prisons are often invisible, the rodeo forced visibility, though not always in a flattering way. Inside Angola, the rodeo did not change sentences. It did not shorten time. It did not erase guilt or trauma, but it interrupted the rhythm of incarceration. For some, that interruption mattered deeply. The ethical question remained unresolved because it had no simple answer. The rodeo existed at the intersection of consent, coercion, tradition, punishment, and economics. Each perspective revealed a different truth. As Angola continued operating into the modern era, the rodeo persisted, altered, defended, criticized, and debated, but never fully resolved. It existed not because it was universally accepted, but because it served multiple purposes at once. And as long as those purposes remained useful, the rodeo endured. As the Angola Prison Rodeo grew in popularity, it became something no other prison in America had ever produced, a public-facing spectacle built inside one of the most violent and permanent incarceration systems in the country. By the late 20th century, thousands of visitors were arriving regularly, lining up outside the gates of Louisiana State Penitentiary to watch inmates ride bulls, wrestle livestock, and compete in events that carried a real risk of injury or death. For many spectators, the rodeo felt surreal. Beyond the fences stood men serving life sentences, some convicted of violent crimes, others sentenced under laws that offered no realistic chance of release. Inside the arena, those same men became performers, cheered on by crowds who would return to the free world at the end of the day. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Supporters of the rodeo argued that participation was voluntary, that inmates chose to compete, and that the event provided rare opportunities for purpose and reward inside a prison where monotony and despair were constant. Prize money, they claimed, allowed inmates to support families, pay legal fees, or afford small comforts from commissary. The rodeo, in this framing, was presented as a form of empowerment within confinement. But critics saw something else. They saw a system where men with nothing left to lose were encouraged to risk their bodies for entertainment. They questioned whether choice truly existed inside a prison where daily life offered few alternatives for meaning, income, or recognition. In Angola, where the majority of inmates were serving life sentences, participation in the rodeo often represented one of the only chances to feel visible, valued, or temporarily alive. This raised an uncomfortable question. When freedom is removed, can consent ever be fully voluntary? The physical danger of the Angola Prison Rodeo was never hidden. Events like bull riding, wild cow milking, and convict poker carried real consequences. Injuries were common. Broken bones, concussions, and internal injuries occurred regularly. Medical staff were present, but the risk was accepted as part of the spectacle. In convict poker, inmates sat at a table while a bull was released into the arena, with the last man remaining seated declared the winner. The crowd cheered not for skill, but for endurance and bravery in the face of imminent harm. The spectacle relied on danger to maintain its appeal. To supporters, this danger was part of the tradition of rodeo culture itself, a sport historically rooted in risk. To critics, the optics were disturbing. Incarcerated men risking serious injury while spectators laughed, clapped, and bought souvenirs. The rodeo's profits added another layer of complexity. Revenue generated from ticket sales, concessions, and merchandise was used to fund inmate programs, education, and recreational activities not otherwise supported by state budgets. Angola became financially self-sustaining in ways most prisons were not. This financial independence allowed prison administrators to argue that the rodeo benefited inmates as a whole, even those who never participated. Yet the question remained, should inmate welfare depend on spectacle? Angola Prison itself had a history that made the rodeo even more controversial. For decades, the prison was known as one of the most violent in America, plagued by inmate-on-inmate murders, corruption, and neglect. Many of the men performing in the rodeo had survived an era when Angola was referred to as the bloodiest prison in the South. Violence was not abstract to them. It was lived experience. Some critics argued that the rodeo did not represent rehabilitation or empowerment, but rather a continuation of exploitation rooted in Angola's past as a former plantation. The imagery was difficult to separate. Incarcerated men, many of them black, performing dangerous labor for public amusement on land that once relied on enslaved labor. This comparison was not lost on observers. Defenders of the rodeo rejected this interpretation, insisting that participation offered dignity rather than degradation. They pointed to inmates who spoke proudly about their involvement, describing the rodeo as a chance to feel human, to experience adrenaline, and to be recognized for something other than their crimes. For some inmates, the rodeo became an identity. Training, preparation, and participation gave structure to lives otherwise defined by routine and restriction. In a prison where most inmates would never be released, the rodeo provided moments that broke the endless repetition of days. But the presence of meaning does not erase power imbalance. In Angola, refusal to participate in the rodeo carried no formal punishment, but the absence of alternatives mattered. Work programs paid minimal wages. Opportunities for recognition were scarce. The rodeo stood out precisely because it was exceptional, because it offered something different in a place defined by sameness. This made the concept of choice complicated. Medical staff and administrators monitored injuries closely, but the underlying risk could never be eliminated. Bulls do not differentiate between free riders and incarcerated ones. When injuries occurred, they were treated within the prison medical system, a system already stretched thin by an aging population serving long sentences. Some inmates returned to their cells injured, facing months of recovery inside confinement. For those serving life sentences, long-term physical damage could mean decades of pain without meaningful recourse. Public reaction to the Angola Prison Rodeo has always been divided. Some visitors describe it as one of the most moving experiences of their lives, a raw display of humanity, courage, and resilience. Others leave disturbed, questioning whether they had participated in something ethically questionable. Over time, media coverage shifted. Early portrayals framed the rodeo as a unique curiosity. Later reporting became more critical, focusing on race, incarceration, consent, and exploitation. Human rights organizations began raising concerns about whether such events should exist at all within modern correctional systems. Yet the rodeo continued. Part of its endurance lies in how it defies simple categorization. It is not purely entertainment. It is not purely exploitation. It exists in a gray space shaped by incarceration, economics, culture, and power. Angola Prison itself operates under a philosophy that emphasizes order, permanence, and self-sufficiency. The rodeo fits within that worldview, a controlled outlet within a controlled environment. For administrators, it represents stability and funding. For some inmates, it represents purpose. For critics, it represents a failure to imagine humane alternatives. As debates continue, the Angola Prison Rodeo remains a symbol, not just of incarceration, but of how society chooses to interact with those it has locked away. It forces audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about punishment, entertainment, and the boundaries of consent under confinement. And as long as the rodeo continues, those questions remain unresolved. The story of the Angola Prison Rodeo is not simply about bulls, inmates, or spectators. It is about power, survival, and the uneasy relationship between freedom and captivity, a relationship that cannot be neatly explained or easily justified. And the discussion surrounding it is far from over.